These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Now it gets a little more interesting. The two sides have a knot of pieces in the middle of black's end of the board. How can white take advantage? Look for pins. The important point to see is that white's rook on c7 pins the black rook on d7. The next thought is to try to take the pinned rook, but you see that this cannot now be done because the rook is protected as many times as it is attacked, twice each way. You think about adding more pressure against the pinned piece with, say, 1. Queen moves to b5, but you have to consider black's options as well as yours, and with so many pieces clustered in the picture it's not surprising that he has his own resources to try. He can play 1. Black rook on from d7 takes rook c7. The pin is removed, and if white plays queen takes queen, black just replies rook takes queen. Lesson: if the enemy's pinned piece has the power to take your pinning piece, ask what the consequences of that defense would be. Since immediately adding pressure doesn't work, a next thing to consider is a preliminary exchange of the pinned piece to simplify matters. White starts with 1. Rook on from d6 takes rook d7 plus, and black is forced to reply rook takes at d7 unless he wants to just let go of the rook. The pinned piece is left attacked once and defended once. Now try adding 2. Queen moves to b5. This time it works. If 2. Black rook on from d7 takes rook c7, white plays 3. Queen takes queen and black's queen is lost since it has no defender. Notice that black can't play the defense too. Black rook moves to d1, check. Followed by queen takes queen. After white fends off the check, the rook on d7 remains pinned to its king. In effect the black rook ends up in a cross pin, pinned to its king by white's rook and to its queen by white's queen. We will study more examples of cross pins later. The point for now is to see how taking the pinned piece and calling for its replacement can improve your ability to put decisive pressure on the pinned position. White to move. What is the best move? This one requires some foresight. The square to notice is e6. It looks unassuming, but it's the focus of the pressures on the board. It is attacked twice by white and defended twice by black. As we know, in this sort of position it pays to ask what would happen if those potential exchanges all were made, so that the board became simplified with the last enemy piece left standing on the contested square. What would then be possible? The train of thought is especially important here because the disputed square is on a diagonal with the black king, suggesting the possibility of a pin once the smoke clears. White has his light-squared bishop positioned to move to d5, making the chance for a pin more than hypothetical. So think through the sequence. White plays knight takes at e6, black replies bishop takes knight. White plays rook takes bishop, black replies queen takes rook. Now white plays bishop takes at d5, pinning the queen and winning it a move later. Of course a piece that pins the queen needs protection, and here the bishop gets it from the rook on d1. The knight on d4 would have been moved out of the way 2 moves earlier. When you imagine using a piece during a sequence, be careful to imagine that the square it used to occupy becomes vacant. In a sense this position, like others we recently have seen, just involves upgrading a target. The pawn on e6 eventually is traded up to a queen. But in practice you might not see the possibility of the pin right away here because the target of it looks so unpromising at first. Still, anytime your bishop is one move from being able to land on the enemy king's diagonal and pin anything there, it's worth asking whether exchanges on that square might make the pin profitable. Black to move. What is the best move? Here's a study in the defensive side of our current theme. Black sees that white's pawn on c5 is attacked twice and protected just once. He's tempted to play rook takes at c5, picking up the pawn for nothing since white doesn't dare recapture. But the thing to see is that the contested square c5 is on an open diagonal with black's own king. As soon as he plays rook takes at c5 his rook is poised to be pinned. White then has queen moves to b4, and now it's black's rook that is attacked twice and protected only once and paralyzed to boot. It is lost next move. The point of the position is to think carefully when you are looking at a possible series of exchanges and tallying up how many times a square is attacked and defended. Sometimes a piece not currently putting pressure on the square can swoop in afterwards and impose a pin that changes everything. The time to worry most about this, of course, is when the contested square is on a line with either king. White to move. What is the best move? Clearing excess enemy pieces. Sometimes you will find not one but 2 or 3 enemy pieces lined up on the same file or diagonal with their king. It may be that none of them can then be pinned, because a working pin, at least of the kind we now are examining, requires an unobstructed path from the king to the pinned piece and from the pinned piece to the pinning piece. How do you deal with excess enemy pieces on the needed line? There are a couple of standard ways. You might be able to threaten or lure one or more of them out of the way, or you might be able to capture one of the enemy pieces in a manner that requires the other enemy piece or the enemy king to recapture, thus simplifying the line and leaving the remaining piece pinned. In this first example to the left, an inspection of black's king and its lines turns up two enemy pieces aligned with it, the knight and bishop on the d file. Indeed, white's rook on d1 already exerts the needed pressure for the pin. If either the bishop or knight were removed from the picture, the pin would be complete. This can be achieved by chasing one of the pieces away, and the best way to do this is with a pawn. Pieces flee pawns, they can't afford to be captured by them. So white plays pawn from c2 moves to c4, and suppose black moves his knight in reply. Now the bishop on d6 is left pinned. It has protection, so how should the pin be exploited? With another push of the same pawn, white plays pawn from c4 moves to c5, and the bishop gets taken a move later. When white initially moves his pawn to c4, it might have occurred to you that, instead of moving the knight on d5, black can use his other knight to capture the pawn. Yes, but of course black's other knight is then left loose, and white takes it with his rook. Still, that sequence does at least get black a pawn in return for his lost piece. Black to move. What is the best move? Here's the current concept seen from black's side, and this time against a castled king. One of the hazards of allowing a king to lose part of its pawn cover is that pieces can then be pinned to it. Here white's knight and bishop are lined up with black's queen aimed through both of them like a kebab. If one of the white pieces could be removed, the one left behind would be pinned to the king. Again black makes use of a pawn from h5 moves to h4, and white's knight has to vacate its square to survive. Now the bishop is paralyzed, and again the pawn simply marches forward to take it with pawn from h4 moves to h3 and then pawn from h3 takes bishop a move later. White to move. What is the best move? On the surface this position does not look much like the others in this chapter, but again a scan of the king's file turns up two enemy men in line with it apiece, the queen on g2, and a pawn, on g7. If the pawn were out of the way, white could pin the queen with rook moves to g1. Threatening the pawn won't work, you can't scare a pawn if it has protection, and even a frightened pawn can't move off of its file. The standard way to clear an enemy pawn, rather, is to take something it protects, inviting the pawn to move off its file to perform the recapture. The g7 pawn protects the knight on h6, so white plays rook takes knight, black replies pawn from g7 takes rook, and now rook moves to g1 pins black's queen, with protection furnished by the knight on e2. You might think you could also make gains here by playing the same idea in reversed order. Rook moves to g1, then, when the black queen moves, pawn from h5 takes knight, with the pawn on g7 pinned and unable to recapture. Not quite, however. Black replies to rook moves to g1 with queen takes at f2, and then if white takes the h6 knight with his other rook, black has queen takes at e3, a fork of white's h6 rook and his bishop on d3, both of which are loose. White still can pull his chestnuts out of the fire by moving his queen to d6, threatening black's loose bishop, and then to h2, threatening to mate with the rook already on the h-file, but these kinds of complications are beyond the scope of the current lesson. Still, it's worth studying the initial forking idea for black here that makes rook moves to g1 not so attractive as a first move for white. It would be easy to overlook. A key to not overlooking it is to be mindful at all times of loose pieces on the board, your own as well as your opponent's. As white, you should realize that you have a loose bishop already on d3 and that your rook currently on h5 will be left loose on h6 after the capture. Loose pieces are a big deal. They make good targets for forks, especially by your opponent's queen. Since the whole idea of starting with rook moves to g1 would be to drive off the black queen, you have to ask whether the queen, once driven off, could go make trouble for the loose material you would be leaving around the board. It could indeed. White to move. What is the best move? Consolidating excess enemy pieces. In some respects this position resembles others we have seen recently, but notice that white's position is more vulnerable. Black threatens queen moves to f2, checkmate. And at first blush white seems to have no good defense against it. Again, though, black's king is on the g-file with the pawn and queen spread apart in front of it, again white would be able to pin the queen, and with good protection, by playing rook moves to g1 if the pawn on g7 weren't in the way. This time the pawn can't be moved by taking something it guards because it doesn't guard anything. The situation calls for a different approach. Perhaps the pawn can be captured. This won't help if the piece you use to make the capture is left on the needed file, for then you would have replaced one obstruction with another. But the result may be a useful simplification if your piece will be recaptured by the enemy. The point: white plays rook takes at g7, check. Taking the pawn and also forking black's king and queen. The priority of check requires black to deal with this rather than delivering mate on f2. He has to capture white's rook with king takes rook or queen takes rook. Either way, the three black men on the g-file have been reduced to 2. Now rook moves to g1 pins black's queen. Black plays queen takes rook and allows his queen to be recaptured, and in the end white has traded 2 rooks for a queen and a pawn. More to the point, he has turned a lost position into a winning one. This section is titled Consolidating Enemy Pieces because that is one way of looking at what happens. Enemy pieces spread over multiple squares are, through captures, consolidated down to a single square, which then becomes a suitable target for a pin. White to move. What is the best move? Here the key line is the long diagonal where black has a queen and two pawns lined up with his king. The cluster of king and queen alone should get you thinking about a pin. To the untrained eye, the black pawns on the diagonal might seem to scotch the idea, but you know better. It may be possible to avoid such pawns or get rid of them, turning the other piece on the line into a pinnable target. Start by looking for a piece of your own that can reach the line at issue. Here you see that your dark squared bishop can get to e5 in one move, and that if the pawn on f6 were removed, bishop moves to e5 would pin the queen. The pawn protects nothing that you can take, but again you can capture it. Rook takes at f6 picks up a pawn, and now if black plays queen takes rook, his queen is ready to be pinned with bishop moves to e5, the bishop takes protection from the rook on e4. Black plays queen takes bishop, and after white recaptures he has won a queen and a pawn for a rook and a bishop. Black to move. What is the best move? A look at the white king's lines turns up possible targets for a pin on the diagonal, but one too many of them. Removing white's rook or queen from the board would leave the other piece pinned. If black could take white's queen, white would recapture with his king and the rook would be pinned, but that's impossible. So consider the other end. Can black take white's rook? Yes, with the pinning piece, queen takes rook, leading to queen takes queen. Now white's queen and king are alone on the long diagonal and the board is arranged for a pin. By using the queen to capture, of course, black lost the pin that was in place at the start, but now he creates a fresh one with bishop moves to b7. The bishop pins the queen with protection from the knight on d6. White's queen is lost, producing a net gain for black. Lesson: sometimes you can consolidate excess enemy pieces by taking one of them with the pinning piece, then imposing a fresh pin once the line has been simplified to just the king and the target. White to move. What is the best move? Getting the pinning piece to the pinning square. Once you find or create the kernel of a pin, an enemy piece lined up with its king with nothing between them, you have to a. Figure out what piece you can use to impose the pin and b. Get it onto the square it needs. Sometimes the path to the pinning square is not clear, and in that case there are standard methods to consider to remove the obstructions. We start with the easy case to the left. Searching from the black king outward, you see the knight on e4 is ripe to be pinned. It's on a diagonal, so the pin would require a queen or light squared bishop. The bishop is available, but its path to the pinning square is blocked by white's own rook on e2. When one of your own pieces obstructs the path of another, the usual solution is to vacate the obstructing piece in a violent manner that requires a reply. Here the rook can take the knight on the pinnable square, so white plays rook takes knight, black replies rook takes rook, and now the way is clear for white to play bishop moves to d3, pinning the rook and taking it a move later. White ends up a knight to the good. By the way, this is another case where white also starts with a relative pin in place. If black moves his knight, white has rook takes rook. Though our full study of relative pins will come later, we can ask briefly whether it makes sense for white to exploit this one by attacking the knight with bishop moves to g2. Black has a natural response. He saves his knight and uses it to protect the rook by playing knight moves to d6. Now white plays rook takes rook, black plays knight takes rook, and white has bishop takes at b7, for notice that bishop moves to g2 also cross-pinned black's knight to the loose pawn on b7. But this only nets a pawn. White still should win, but not as easily as he would with a whole extra piece. White to move. What is the best move? Your train of thought this time might begin with the observation that black has pinnable pieces on two axes, his knight on e7 and his bishop on f5. At first, pinning the knight seems the more plausible idea because white can do it right away with bishop moves to d6, but then there is no decisive follow-up. The knight itself is guarded, so taking it won't be profitable. It might seem that white could take advantage of the knight's paralysis by playing knight takes bishop with impunity, or by starting with bishop takes knight, inviting the recapture king takes bishop and then playing knight takes bishop. But remember that after white imposes the pin, black has a move to play, and he can spend it taking his bishop out of danger. So now think about the other possible target for a pin, black's bishop on f5. At first no pin might seem possible because white's rook is out of range and the bishop is guarded, but be more precise about the obstacles. The bishop has a guard in the e7 knight, and the white rook's path to the pinning square, f3, is blocked by the knight on e3. When these problems are seen together, their solutions suggest themselves. Again we vacate the obstructing piece violently with knight takes bishop. Black replies knight takes knight, and now both problems are gone. The protected target has been replaced with a loose one, the knight, and the rook's path to f3 is clear. Rook moves to f3 will win the knight a move later. Another way to see this idea is to start by experimenting with any exchanges you can force and their consequences. Here white can play knight takes bishop, inviting the reply knight takes knight, a standard swap of minor pieces. What makes it interesting is the aftermath, as now the way is clear for a pin. White to move. What is the best move? Black's queen and rook are on the same rank as his king. At first a pin seems nowhere in sight, it would have to be imposed by white's own rook or queen, and neither can reach the 7th rank. The trick is to look through the obstacles. White has his rooks doubled on the same file as black's rook on d7, if the pawn on d6 weren't in the way, white could play rook takes rook, pinning and then winning black's queen. The question is how to get the pawn off of its file. Do it the usual way, take something the pawn protects. The only thing it guards here is the knight on e5, so white plays queen takes knight, a costly sacrifice, but one that pays off. Black replies pawn from d6 takes queen. Now the obstruction to the pin has been removed, allowing white to play rook takes rook and then win the queen. The rear rook provides the needed cover for the forward one. White nets a piece with the sequence. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a challenging study. The snug alignment of black's king and queen on the same diagonal should jump out at you as the makings of a possible pin. Since the pinned piece would be a queen, the piece doing the pinning would need protection. Bishop moves to c6 therefore wouldn't work. Do you have any protected squares on the king and queen's diagonal? Yes, b5. If white's light squared bishop were there, it would pin the queen and also attack black's rook on a6, which you notice, because you always notice these things, is loose. So the remaining question is whether you can maneuver your bishop to b5 fast enough to achieve the pin. Look for a route to that square for the bishop and you see just one. Bishop moves to d3, then bishop takes at b5. Bishop moves to d3 doesn't check or capture anything, but since it's the natural move to pursue the pin, you imagine it and see what response it would provoke. Let's see, would black move his king to avoid the coming pin? If he does, then white still plays bishop takes at b5 and forks the rook and queen. Would black move his queen or rook so that he could take white's bishop when it lands on b5? He could, but since the bishop has protection from a pawn, white still would win at least the exchange. Black ends up having no good reply to bishop moves to d3 despite having a move he can use to defend against the coming bishop takes at b5. His real problem is that b5 is both a pinning square for white and a forking square of a type familiar from the chapter on bishop forks. Notice the familiar triangle between b5 and black's rook and queen and the king behind the queen. Plus b5 is protected by a white pawn. The square is so strong for white that even with the moves notice black can't avoid being hurt by it. Black's best response to bishop moves to d3 is rook moves to b6, then he can reply to bishop takes at b5 with rook takes bishop and merely suffer pawn from a 4 takes rook, losing the exchange and a pawn. This position does not involve clearing lines. It just involves moving the bishop over to the pinning square in 2 moves, a sequence made possible by some quirks of the position. The first lesson is the importance of realizing when a pinning square exists. Once you have found or created such a square, you can turn your attention to ways of getting a suitable piece there. Second, the position shows the importance of thinking about moves that direct your pieces where you want them to be and thinking carefully about what your opponent would be able to do in reply. Sometimes his options will be more limited than you might expect. White to move. What is the best move? Loosening the pinning square. Now for a couple of examples where the basics of a pin are in place but the needed square is guarded by your opponent. We need not belabor the techniques here since they are familiar from earlier work on loosening a forking square, but a brief look will help make the patterns more visually familiar. In the frame to the left, white sees an obvious kernel of a pin. Black's queen and king are on the same diagonal. White's light squared bishop is available, can reach the pinning square d5 in one move, and will have protection there from its queen. But white sees that the pinning square is protected. Indeed, the square is attacked twice by white but protected twice, by black's queen and knight. What to do? Exchange away one of the guards. White plays bishop takes knight. If black recaptures with pawn from a7 takes bishop, the exchange has left the pinning square with only one black defender. Now white safely can play bishop moves to d5, pinning the queen with support from white's own queen on d1. Black's queen is lost. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's dark squared bishop is poised to move to c5, pinning white's queen. Any problem with this? Yes, white replies knight takes bishop. Black needs to get rid of the white knight on b3 before the pin will work. He can't exchange away the white knight because no black piece attacks it. So now instead of a capture, consider a threat. Black plays pawn from a5 moves to a4, and white's knight must flee unless it is to be sacrificed with only black's pawn as compensation. Accepting that sacrifice actually would be the better part of valor here, since if white does move his knight say, to d2, black follows up with bishop moves to c5, pinning and then taking white's queen with support from the rook on c8. The lesson is to think carefully about the pieces that guard the square you need. Exchanging them away or threatening them with pieces less valuable than themselves may leave the pinning square, or forking square, or whatever square, weak enough for occupation. By the way, white has another line of reply that produces a similar material result. After black starts with pawn from a5 moves to a4, white can try a counterattack, pawn from a2 moves to a3, making a hostage out of black's b4 bishop. The bishop retreats to e7, this buys time for white to take his queen out of danger, 2, and with a threat, 3 queen moves to a7. Again black retreats, 3 black bishop moves to d8. Remember that black still has a pawn on a4 threatening to take the b3 knight, so now white plays 4. And pawn from c3 takes at a4, removing that pawn. Alas, black has another pawn at b5, and uses it to recapture, for black pawn from b5 takes knight a4. White can take that pawn with his queen, but then black also has n pawn from c4 takes at e5. Black ends up with a knight and a pawn in return for 2 pawns. White has to play 4. And pawn from file c takes at a4, by the way, in part to protect against black's use of b6 to launch a bishop fork against white's king and queen, but this is getting rather involved. That last paragraph assumes that white deals with the black pawn on a4 by capturing it. You might wonder whether white could instead just move the b3 knight to a safer square, such as c1. But if play goes as we've been describing, that knight move has a troubling consequence. Black can then move his bishop, now on d8, remember, to b6, which forks the white king and queen. By instead playing knight takes at a4, White throws an attacker at the b6 square and so heads off the fork. Black still takes the knight with his b-pawn, but then White has a move to take his queen out of forking range. White to move. What is the best move? Protecting the pinning piece. We have seen that if you pin the enemy queen to its king, the queen always will, in principle, be able to take the piece that pins it. The reason, of course, is that the only pieces capable of imposing a pin are your bishop, rook, and queen, and the enemy queen can move in the same way as any of them. This generally means that any piece that pins the queen requires protection. There are exceptions to this statement that we will consider later, but it holds as a general rule. We already have seen the point a few times, so here we need spend only a few examples on techniques for bringing the needed protection into existence. This first position is an easy illustration of the goal. White sees Black's king and queen on the same rank. The way is clear for him to impose a pin with rook moves to a8. But before pinning the queen, a piece needs protection, something to prevent Black from playing queen takes rook. He has it in his bishop. Thus rook moves to a8 safely pins and wins the queen for a rook. White to move. What is the best move? Here again is the position you want to achieve. White sees a possible pin of Black's queen. He can impose it with his bishop or his queen. Obviously he will use his bishop so that the pin is profitable, but it will need protection to prevent Black from just replying queen takes bishop. Fortunately the pinning square c4 already is guarded once by White's queen, so he can play bishop moves to c4 without concern. Black's queen is lost, it can't play queen takes queen, and instead has to settle for taking White's bishop and then being taken itself. Of course White also can make slightly lesser gains here by playing queen takes queen, then after the recapture rook takes queen he has bishop moves to c4, pinning the rook and winning it a move later. It's a classic substitution of a harder to pin piece with one that is easier to pin, but it's not necessary. White to move. What is the best move? There is a classic pattern in which a rook on its first rank, here the f1 rook, slides out onto an open file to pin the enemy queen. One reason the pattern is common is that a rook on the first rank often has automatic protection already in place from its fellow rook, or the queen, or the king, giving it the protection it needs to go after the enemy queen. In this case, white sees black's king and queen adjacent on the e-file, and he has a rook he can move to that file with protection from his other rook. With those elements in place, the presence of white's own knight on e5 becomes an opportunity rather than an obstacle. It can take something, and if black spends any time recapturing it, white then can play rook moves to e1. White spends his free move with the knight playing a capture, knight takes knight. Black can't afford to recapture, as he must act to avoid the pin. Rook moves to e1. White to move. What is the best move? The presence of black's king and queen on the same file cries out rook pin. You have a rook you can use to do it, the one on e3, which can be transferred to g3. The remaining question is whether the pinning square is safe not only from black's queen, but from the pawn on f4. On inspection, it is. The rook has protection against the queen from the knight on h1, and once the rook moves to g3, which must be carefully imagined, the pawn on f4 will not be able to capture it, because the pawn will become pinned to its queen by white's bishop on d2. That is as much as this example is meant to show, but the probable result after 1. Our pawn from e3 moves to g3 is 1. Black queen takes rook, 2. Knight takes queen, pawn from f4 takes knight, 3. Pawn from f1 takes rook f8 plus, bishop takes rook, 4. Queen moves to e5, forking the black pawns on c7 and g3, and making the capture on g3 a move later. White has won a queen and a pawn in return for a bishop and rook. Another possibility is that black replies to 1. Rook moves to g3 by interposing his d7 bishop on g4 to disrupt the pin. Now there's a big round of liquidations in which white ends up ahead by a piece. White to move. What is the best move? White's attention to the black king's lines turns up the queen on d4, ready to be pinned on the long dark squared diagonal. White's dark squared bishop is prepared to do the job by moving to c3. But a piece that pins the queen needs protection, and at c3 the bishop would have none. Black would merely play queen takes bishop. Can protection be arranged? What white needs are forcing moves that not only create the needed protection but keep black too busy to escape the coming pin. Checks are best for this purpose, and white's queen is in a position to check black's king easily. The concept becomes clear. Think backwards about how the white queen can check its way onto g3, where it then would protect the pinning square, c3. He starts with queen moves to h4, check. Which requires black to spend a move playing king moves to g8. Then white has queen moves to g3, check. Which requires black to spend more time moving his king back to h8, this reconstructs the kernel of the pin by putting black's king back in line with his queen. Now that white's queen has worked its way down to the third rank, he safely can play the pin bishop moves to c3, winning black's queen for a bishop. Black to move. What is the best move? Do the standard scan of the lines leading away from white's king. Do you see a pinning possibility? It's easy to overlook the bishop on e3, but there it is, a piece lined up with its king. We know that a bishop on its king's diagonal is itself an unsuitable target for a pin, but we also know that it sometimes can be swapped out for a better one. If black plays rook takes bishop, white has to reply queen takes rook to recoup his loss, and now white's queen and king would be aligned. Would black have a tool usable to impose a pin? Yes, his fianchet dark squared bishop on g7 is poised to move to d4. One difficulty remains, though, black needs a guard for d4, the pinning square. In thinking about how to do this, don't overlook pieces already trained on the needed square but blocked, for maybe the blockages can be removed. Here black's queen is pointed at d4. The rook on e4 would be out of the way after the exchange just discussed, leaving only the f4 pawn cluttering the line. How do we clear a pawn from its rank? Take something it protects as with knight takes at g5. Put these points together and we have the sequence for black: 1, knight takes at g5, 2 pawn from f4 takes knight, rook takes bishop, 3 queen takes rook, bishop moves to d4, and now the queen is pinned by a bishop that enjoys protection from black's queen. There were other ways you could have tried to provide protection for d4, such as pawn from c7 moves to c5. But that's not a forcing move. When you are playing sequences that are meant to set up a pin, you want to operate with checks, captures, and threats that limit your opponent's range of replies. In reply to pawn from c7 moves to c5, for example, white just plays bishop takes rook and the pinning threat is extinguished. The beauty of knight takes at g5 for black is that it not only takes a pawn but threatens white's queen immediately and threatens serious trouble for white's king. Knight moves to h3 would create lots of problems. So replying pawn from f4 takes knight is hard to resist for white, and it achieves black's goal of getting white's pawn off the fourth rank. White to move. What is the best move? Pushing the enemy king into line. We have examined how to make the pinned piece a suitable target and how to get your pinning piece onto the square it needs. But every example of both issues has started with the observation that an enemy piece is aligned with its king. Our next task is to learn how to create that alignment when it doesn't already exist. The principal tools we will use here are checks that push the king into a line with one of its fellow pieces, or that require an enemy piece to jump into line with its king to protect it. Or sometimes a capture may require a king to recapture and cause it to walk into a pin. The core idea is illustrated to the left. White has no pins or other tactical openings at hand. He might follow the standard practice of examining the consequences of any checks he can inflict. There are two: rook takes at g7 and rook moves to a8. The first of those loses the rook to king takes rook, but rook moves to a8 is more interesting. Black has just one safe reply: king moves to f7. White sees that this brings black's king onto the same file as his bishop and immediately causes the bishop to be pinned, since white already has a rook on the f file. Black's reply to the check thus makes his bishop a sitting duck, so the question for white is how to attack it. Pawns are best for the purpose wherever they're available. Here white plays pawn from e4 moves to e5 and uses the pawn to take the bishop a move later. Now try to start not by looking for checks but by just seeing the visual pattern. The white rook aimed not just at the black bishop but through it and almost at the black king, which is one file away. If only the black king were on f8, just behind the bishop, so you look for a check that nudges the king that way. When you see an idea like this, it's a good habit to think about the move order and ask what happens if you fiddle with it. Here the thought might be to start with pawn from e4 moves to e5. Then if black plays bishop takes at e5, white has rook moves to a8 and mates. Or does he? You have to be mindful of all of black's resources. He has a rook on b3, and so can reply to white's rook moves to a8 with rook moves to b8, where the black rook would take protection from the bishop then on e5. So it's better to start with the check, create the pin, and then go after the bishop, but it's important to see both variations, because the second one almost is better. White to move. What is the best move? Again the idea in simplest form. White has a rook and a bishop against black's queen. How to play from here? Start by examining your check. White's only one is rook moves to a1, check. Black has to move his king to b8. White sees that this would put the king right behind the queen on the same dark squared diagonal. This invites to. Bishop moves to f4, pinning the queen with protection from the pawn on g3. White wins.